basement of the old house smelled perpetually of damp earth and forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the single, weak shaft of sunlight that angled through a grimy window near the ceiling, illuminating to figures locked in silent, furious contention. These were the only surviving children of Elias Hawthorne Marcus, the eldest, a man whose tailored suit failed to hide his underlying impatience and avarice, and Clara, the younger, whose veneer of bohemian calm was cracking under the immense pressure of their shared toxic history. They stood inches apart, their gazes fixed on a singular, rusted object resting on a dusty workbench, a small, heavy lockbox. Elias, their father, had been an enigma, a man whose quiet, eccentric life had been spent collecting strange artifacts and ancient texts rather than wealth. His funeral had been a sparse affair, punctuated only by the siblings' tense silence and the lawyer's terse reading of the will. The will was simple, devastatingly so. The house, the small savings, and the lockbox, everything else had been liquidated long ago to fund Elias's obscure passions. Marcus and Clara, both certain their father had secretly hoarded a fortune worthy of his lifelong obsession, were consumed by the lockbox's promise. The two had rushed to the old house immediately after the burial, skipping the meager reception, driven by a shared blinding greed. They hadn't spoken civilly in years, their relationship poisoned by decades of petty rivalries and Elias's emotional neglect, which they had long ago internalized. As a competition for a financial prize, they believed the lockbox held the key to their respective financial salvation. Marcus, who was drowning in high-interest debt, and Clara, who desperately sought the capital to start a new life far from the city's suffocating expectations. The lockbox itself was unremarkable, forged from thick, pitted iron, its surface marred by decades of humidity and neglect. It possessed an antique brass handle and a thick, circular lock for which no key had been found. It weighed considerably, but then its size suggested a fact that only fueled their escalating anticipation. They had tried fruitlessly to pry it open with tools scavenged from the workbench, but the iron held fast. The lock was a relic impervious to their brute force attempts. Marcus, his face slick with sweat despite the basement's chill, finally stepped back, his expensive shoes kicking up fine, chalky dust. He wiped his brow, his voice a low, grating whisper. He accused Clara of somehow knowing the combination, of attempting to defraud him. Clara countered with equal venom, pointing out Marcus's long history of financial deceit and betrayal, recalling time he had quietly sold off their grandmother's antique jewelry behind her back. Argument devolved quickly, escalating beyond the lockbox to encompass every ancient slight, every forgotten cruel word, every instance of emotional damage their shared past contained. They were not fighting over money anymore, but over the right to claim the final victory in a lifelong sibling war. Finally, Clara, exhausted and disgusted, walked over to a high shelf and retrieved an old, rusty hacksaw. It was clumsy and dull, but it was their only remaining option. They worked in miserable silence, taking turns sawing through the thick brass mechanism. The noise echoed deafeningly in the confined space, a desperate, metallic scream against the quiet decay of the house. Ours bled together. The light outside the small window faded entirely, plunging the basement into absolute darkness save for the sickly yellow glow of a single hanging work lamp. Just as frustration threatened to break their resolve, the lock finally gave way with a sharp, wrenching snap. They both recoiled, breathing heavily, their eyes wide and glittering in the harsh light. The moment of truth. Marcus lunged first, pulling the heavy lid open. The expected cascade of gold coins, the stacks of ancient bearer bonds, or the velvet pouch filled with gems, none of it materialized. The interior was lined with crumbling, aged felt. Resting within, nestled in the dust, was a single object. It was an artifact of profound strangeness, a small, dark wooden carving crudely shaped, depicting a figure that was vaguely human but disproportionately slender and elongated. Its head tilted perpetually upward as if in silent supplication or eternal dread. It was adorned with fine cracks, and where its eyes should have been were too tiny, polished obsidian stones that seemed to drink the light of the basement lamp. It was utterly worthless financially. A cold, heavy silence fell, heavier than a lockbox itself. Disbelief morphed instantly into raging fury. Clara screamed first, a sound of utter betrayal. She grabbed the carving and threw it against the wall, where it hit with a dull, hollow thud, yet remained remarkably intact. Marcus staggered back, running his hands through his hair, convinced this was some final, sick joke engineered by their father to punish them for their greed. The disappointment was so visceral it felt like a physical wound. They had been robbed, not by a thief, but by the very man they had hoped would save them. Their venom, now redirected from the artifact, turned instantly back on each other, blaming the other for their shared delusion. Clara, trembling, began systematically tearing through the rest of the basement. Convinced there was a secret compartment, a hidden cache, Marcus, in a fit of rage, grabbed the lockbox and slammed it against the workbench. It was then, as the metal groaned, that he noticed a faint, almost invisible inscription etched beneath the original brass lock plate, a single word, barely legible beneath the grime. Remember, he left us nothing. Marcus spat, dropping the box. Nothing but this stupid trinket and a joke. Clara stopped her frantic search and walked back, her expression hard. She picked up the wooden carving, examining the strange, tilted head and the cold obsidian eyes. The sheer anticlimactic nature of the inheritance left them hollowed out, their decades of competitive striving ending in a cheap, bizarre wooden doll. As Clara held the carving, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth spread from the wood into her hand. She felt a subtle, unsettling shift in the atmosphere, a drop in temperature that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She looked at the tiny, upturned head of the figure, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, she thought she saw the obsidian eyes reflect a movement that wasn't there. Then the single work lamp above them, the only source of light in the entire space, began to flicker erratically. The sound of the basement furnace, which had been silent for years, suddenly roared to life with a rusty, metallic shriek that echoed off the damp stone walls. Marcus and Clara exchanged a look, their fury momentarily eclipsed by a primal, shared fear. The sound was deafening, suffocating. They both backed away instinctively toward the narrow, wooden stairs leading up. The furnace continued to scream, its noise growing louder, hotter, as if something ancient and powerful had just been awakened by the opening of the box and the handling of the carving. Just as they reached the stairs, the single lamp above them blew out with a sharp, violent pop. The basement plunged into total, suffocating darkness and the terrifying blackness. The furnace's roar seemed to transform, taking on a guttural, almost rhythmic quality, and from the direction of the workbench where the lockbox lay open, Clara heard a faint sound, the heavy, unmistakable scrape of iron being dragged slowly across the concrete floor. She still clutched the wooden figure, its surface now burning hot in her grasp. A terrifying realization dawning on her. The inheritance was not money, and it was not a joke. It was something that had been contained, and now it was free. The darkness in the basement was not just the absence of light. It felt heavy, viscous, pressing down on Marcus and Clara, suffocating their fear. The sound of the furnace roaring with unnatural vigor was the only landmark in the void. They scrambled up the narrow wooden stairs in blind panic, their hands tearing at the loose splinters on the banister. Clara still gripped the wooden carving, its heat a searing reminder that this nightmare was real, not merely a shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and disappointment. They burst into the relative safety of the kitchen, their labored breathing filling the empty, stale air of the house. Marcus fumbled for the light switch, plunging the room into harsh fluorescent glare. They looked at each other, their faces pale and streaked with basement grime, the unspoken question screaming in their eyes. What was that? The silence from the basement now was immediate and absolute. The furnace had stopped roaring as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt even more ominous. Marcus, the pragmatic, Deathtrap businessman, immediately tried to rationalize it. It was the old house, the faulty wiring, the pressure in the ancient boiler finally giving out. Yet the memory of the heavy scrape of iron on concrete moving in the dark defied all logic. Clara, however, could not dismiss the horror so easily. The carving had left a reddish, stinging welt in her palm. She placed the small, unnervingly smooth figure on the kitchen counter, careful not to touch it again. The obsidian eyes, fixed in their upward gaze, seemed to absorb the kitchen light, leaving the carving's features in perpetual shadow. It wasn't just a trinket. It was a conduit, a vessel for whatever had been contained in that ancient lockbox. As they stood there, shaken, a realization dawned on Marcus. Their father's inscription, remember, Elias had not been a wealthy man, but he had been a man obsessed with rituals, with ancient history, with the idea that emotional energy could be imprinted onto objects. He had spent his life exploring the darkest corners of human history. He didn't leave us money. Marcus whispered, the comprehension chilling him to the core. He left us a lesson. Punishment. He was referring not just to the carving, but to the deep, days-long reservoir of sibling rivalry and mutual cruelty that had defined their lives. Elias had always been aware of their toxic competition, their relentless attempts to undermine each other, their collective failure to offer him any genuine affection. The lockbox had been a trap, exploiting their greed to unleash a mechanism of retribution. They decided, in a rare moment of unity born from terror, that the carving had to be destroyed or at least removed from the house. Marcus grabbed a heavy rolling pin and approached the figure. Just as he raised the weapon, the refrigerator, which had been humming steadily, suddenly clicked off. The hum was instantly replaced by a sound so faint it took them a moment to identify it. A child's quiet, sobbing coming from the hall just outside the kitchen door. It wasn't a loud sound, but it was profoundly mournful, a sound from their collective, forgotten childhood. Marcus froze, the rolling pin poised in the air. Clara felt a cold, sharp ache in her chest. The sobbing intensified slightly, moving now, sounding like it was retreating down the main corridor toward the dusty, unused living room. "Stay here," Marcus commanded, though his voice wavered. He crept out of the kitchen, using the rolling pin for balance. Clara remained rooted, her gaze fixed on the carving, which now seemed to vibrate with a faint, internal energy. Marcus moved cautiously down the hall, the house's oppressive silence amplifying the phantom sound. He reached the entrance to the living room and peered in. The room was empty, covered in white dust sheets, casting spectral shapes in the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. There was no child, no figure, but the sound of quiet sobbing was distinctly louder here, clearer. Then the focus of the sound shifted. It was no longer coming from the corner of the room, but from inside the house's walls. And it wasn't just a generic sob. It was accompanied by a voice, muffled and childlike, but undeniably recognizable. It was the sound of his own 6-year-old self, crying uncontrollably. Marcus felt a nauseating wave of dizziness. He recognized the tone, the precise pitch of that childish despair. It was the sound he had made 30 years ago, when he had been locked in that very living room by his older cousin as a cruel joke. Memory he had suppressed for decades. The trauma of the moment, the desperate terror of the darkness, washed over him with the force of a tidal wave. Just as the memory peaked, the crying stopped, replaced by a swift, guttural whisper that seemed to come from right behind his ear. Though the space was empty, you deserved it. Marcus recoiled violently, stumbling back and crashing into the hall table, sending a vase tumbling to the floor. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was not a faulty furnace. This was a psychological assault, a deliberate manifestation of his deepest forgotten wound. He fled back to the kitchen, panting, the fear overriding his professional composure. He found Clara standing immobile, her face pale, the rolling pin now forgotten on the counter. "It's the past," he stammered, his voice raw. "It showed me something, Clara, something I forgot." Clara only nodded, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed his own. She pointed not at the carving, but at the kitchen window overlooking the backyard. The moonlight illuminated the glass and etched into the condensation on the inside of the pane. Drawn with a meticulous, childlike finger were three unmistakable words: "Stolen, stolen, stolen." Clara's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. The words referred to a crime she had committed at the age of 10, a secret shame she thought only she and her father knew. She had stolen a precious, rare stamp from her childhood friend, blaming the theft on her younger brother Julian, who had been punished severely. The guilt of that betrayal, the ruin it brought to Julian, had been a festering core of her emotional life, buried under years of denial. Now, the past was writing itself onto the present. The phantom child's crying from the living room suddenly morphed into a high-pitched, metallic screech that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. It was the sound of Julian's voice, not crying, but screaming in terror as their father had locked him away after Clara's lie. They both understood. The carving, the thing Elias had left them, was using their own guilt, their own suppressed betrayals as fuel. It was resurrecting the moral crimes of their past, forcing them to relive the worst moments of their lives, moments where they had acted with malice and cruelty toward others. The lockbox contained a relic designed for emotional justice, a horrific mirror forcing them to confront their true selves. Marcus, his face contorted with panic, snatched the carving from the counter. "We have to destroy it now." They rushed into the garage, grabbing a heavy sledgehammer. Marcus placed the carving on a concrete block and raised the hammer, his face a mask of desperate resolve. This was the only way to silence the ghosts, to end the assault. He brought the sledgehammer down with all his might. The impact was shocking. Instead of splintering wood, there was a deafening clang like striking solid, dense steel. The hammer rebounded violently, ripping out of Marcus's grasp and flying across the garage. The concrete block was chipped and cracked, but the carving, the simple, crude wooden figure, remained completely intact. Unmoved, the obsidian eyes fixed on Marcus Dodd, and then, from the darkest corner of the garage, where the lawnmower was stored, they heard a new sound. A wet, rasping wheeze, followed by a heavy, deliberate cough, the unmistakable sound of their father, Elias, suffering through his final fatal illness. It was a sound they had both ignored, too busy negotiating his future estate to offer comfort. The sound moved closer, a spectral presence they could feel but not see, filling the garage with the cold, suffocating scent of stale cigarettes and death. Elias was coming for them, using their guilt as his vehicle. The sound of their father's death rattle was the ultimate horror. It was a manifestation not of fear, but of profound, unchangeable guilt, the sound they had deliberately tuned out in his final weeks, prioritizing their financial maneuvering over his suffering. The air in the garage became instantly cold and heavy, thick with the phantom scent of sickness and regret. Marcus and Clara retreated further, scrambling over the workbench, their legs weak, their terror now fully crystallized into the realization they were being judged by a force they could neither understand nor defeat. The dark corner remained empty, yet the oppressive presence of Elias was undeniable. The wheezing cough deepened, transforming into a low, mocking chuckle that resonated in their chests. This was Elias's final, elaborate, and deeply cruel revenge. He hadn't just exposed their sins, he had weaponized them, died Clara. Driven by a desperate need to escape the paralyzing cold, glanced frantically around the garage. Her eyes landed on a faded, dusty tarpaulin covering what looked like a small, ancient, well in the concrete floor, a feature their father had always forbidden them to touch. An idea, reckless and final, flashed through her mind. If they couldn't destroy the carving, they would contain it. She scrambled towards the tarpaulin, grabbing the edges. Marcus, still paralyzed by the spectral wheezing, didn't argue. He only followed, his eyes fixed on the empty corner. They tore the cover away, revealing a circular, rough-hewn stone opening leading down into absolute, unknown blackness. The air that rose from the well was frigid and smelled strongly of brine and mineral deposits, suggesting it went deep into the earth. Clara snatched the unyielding wooden carving from the concrete block. Where Marcus had tried to shatter it, the obsidian eyes seemed to gleam now, anticipating the confrontation. If he wanted it sealed, we put it back where nothing can touch it, she gasped, her voice hoarse. This is the deepest place in the house. Marcus regained a measure of control, his instincts shifting from fear to survival. He grabbed a coil of old rope hanging nearby, knotting one end around the handle of a rusty shovel, preparing to lower the artifact. But as he reached for the carving, the psychological torment intensified. The wheezing ceased, replaced by two distinct, highly personalized sounds emanating from opposite ends of the garage. For Clara, the air was suddenly filled with the faint, rhythmic tearing of paper, the sound of her younger brother, Julian, ripping apart his favorite stamp collection after being falsely accused of theft decades ago. She felt the shame and the malice of that childhood betrayal crush her, seeing the phantom outline of Julian's devastated face in the shadows. For Marcus, the sound was the high-pitched, frantic ringing of a cellular phone, the very phone that had contained the desperate, last-minute plea from his business partner, Thomas, before Thomas, ruined by Marcus's insider trading scheme years ago, had taken his own life. The ringing was incessant, deafening, a relentless auditory assault on his guilt. The carving, resting between them, seemed to pulse, its heat now radiating outward, intensifying the visions. The horror was now inescapable, a personalized, internal, built designed specifically for their worst moral flaws. Clara lunged, throwing the carving into the well's opening. They heard a splash that was far too large and deep for the small size of the object, followed by an immediate, terrifying silence. The ringing stopped. The tearing paper sound vanished. The cold lifted. They stood in the empty garage, breathing deeply, waiting for the backlash, the final apocalyptic terror. But nothing happened. The relief was immediate, overwhelming, and utterly deceptive. Slowly, Marcus and Clara backed away from the lip of the well, their eyes wide with cautious hope. They had stopped it. They had survived their father's revenge. They stumbled out of the garage and into the main house, collapsing on the dusty floor of the entryway. Physically and emotionally drained, they spent the next hour gathering what little was left of their dignity and their belongings, their focus shifting entirely to immediate escape. They didn't speak of the carving, the scraping, or the manifest horrors. The silence was a fragile treaty against the unimaginable trauma they had just endured. As they reached the front door, ready to abandon the house and their pathetic inheritance forever, Clara reached into her jacket pocket for her car keys. Her fingers brushed against something small, smooth, and wooden. A gasp tore from her throat. She pulled the object out and held it up in the faint light filtering through the porch window. It was the carving, the small, elongated figure with the upward tilted head and the cold obsidian eyes. It was completely dry, cool to the touch, and resting casually in her palm, its surface bearing no trace of the well's brackish water dot. Marcus saw it, and the color drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly white. His rational mind fractured completely. They hadn't contained the relic, they had simply carried it with them. Elias's revenge wasn't confined to the house, it was mobile, attached to them. As the dawning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the floor, a final horrifying realization settled over them. They looked at the figure, then at each other. their faces reflecting a lifetime of accumulated toxicity and selfish acts. They were the source. Power supply. Carving didn't manifest random terror, it manifested their moral failures, the trauma they inflicted on others. The final silent judgment came not from the carving, but from the realization it forced upon them. The inheritance was the realization of their own poison nature. They were trapped, forced to carry the physical embodiment of their guilt, an instrument that would continuously resurrect their darkest memories and their victims' despair, until they were driven to madness, or perhaps to a true, permanent confession of their sins. Marcus and Clara stood frozen by the door, the wooden figure lying between them on the floor, waiting. They knew, with a certainty colder than the basement air, that as soon as they moved, as soon as they tried to restart their normal, deceitful lives, the haunting would begin again, deeper, more personal, more devastating than before. Their past was their future, and the horror was only just beginning.